"You don't get to be the one that finishes my story," he said, voice gravel-soft. "Then don't let them finish it for me," she whispered. Arizona Territory, late summer, 1882. The cottonwoods along the dry arroyo had lost more leaves than they had left, and the sky was a white lid pressing down on the land. Dust crawled along the trail like a thing with memory. Thomas Maddox rode slower than usual, hands easy on the reins. Eyes trained the way a man who has spent too many nights alone trains them. For motion that shouldn't be there. He found the tree before he heard the breathing. A rope looped over a low bough. A crude board nailed into the trunk with words scrawled in a shaking hand. "Half-blood, nitrogen monoxide place here." A body hung beneath it. Wrists bound, head lolled to one side. The dress was torn, hair matted. A face already beginning to lose the color of life. Tomas could count more than the scars. The slow, certain cruelty of a mob's message, the ash in a child's eyes. He dismounted like a man stepping into cold water. When she shuddered and gave a small, frightened gasp, Tomas caught himself swearing without thinking. He slid his knife free and cut the rope. She collapsed into his arms like a bird that forgot it could fly. She tasted like fever and dust. Her skin was bronzed where the sun had eaten it, and paler where the rope had burned grooves. One eye glittered open and saw him, and in it was the raw question of someone who had been left on the margin of the world and was surprised to find another person there. "I'm not here to drag you back up," Tomas said, low and quick. "I'm here to get you down." She didn't answer. Her fingers curled weakly around his shirt, and he felt the tremor that belonged to someone who was used to silence. Not to being caught, he led her to his horse, wrapped her in his coat, and rode the last miles to a homestead where the name Maddox hung on a gatepost, and a single lamp threw a thin circle of light across his sleeping porch. The world had made its decisions outside. Inside, he set her on a straw bed and set about finding water and stitches like a man practiced in mending more than just animals. The first night was a study in small mercies. Tomas borrowed clean cloth from a drawer and warmed water over the stove. He spoke to her while he worked because silence has teeth. He cleaned the rope marks, tied bandages with hands that remembered hips and harnesses, and sat for a long time on the floor after the lamp guttered low and the house went to its own breathing. When she woke with a start, the fear made her small and sharp. Tomas kept his distance because he did not want to scare the last of her courage away. Outside, coyotes talked to the moon, and the house smelled like coffee and cedar. She drank from a cup he set at her lips and did not spill a drop. "What is your name?" he asked, because names make people real. She stared at the rim of the cup and then at him. For a moment she looked as if she might speak, but the sound did not come. Finally, "Luz," she said, one syllable fragile as a moth. "Luz," Tomas repeated. "You'll get water, and you'll get rest. That's the plan." She laughed then, a sound that had little humor but a great deal of disbelief. "People leave me plans." "That changes now," he said. "You don't have to carry someone's plan that wasn't yours to carry." She closed her eyes, relief and suspicion in equal measure. She let him tend to her. Let him be the man who stayed. 3 mornings passed and Tomas watched as Luz ate more each day, sat by the window and listened to the road. The scar at her throat told part of a tale, something carved by hatred, a brand that demanded more than blood to explain. One evening, curious and careful, he asked. She touched the scar as if it were a fossil. "They said my mother burned the settler's house," she said. "They said my blood was half theirs and that it made me a monster. They tied me up to teach others. They burned my tent. They shot my brothers. They left me on a tree and called me a warning." Tomas felt the road sharpen in his mouth. He had seen law bend to cruelty before, the sheriff's lack of backbone, the men who thought they owned justice, but this felt like a different cruelty, private. Ragged, close to home. "You're not a monster," he said. You're not what they say." She stared at him for a long time. "Then why did you cut me down?" "Because nobody should be the story the rest of them warn each other with," Tomas said. "Because I know what it feels like to be marked for something you didn't do. I know the taste of it." They didn't speak of his past. He had no obligation to, and she had more pressing things to tend to: hunger, sleep, the slow rebuilding of a person. But in the quiet hours, the two of them began to fit into a pattern. Food on the table, wood stacked, eyes turned to the road. He kept the rifle by the bed. A stranger's boot left prints that Tomas recognized as military, the way some men recognize whiskey by the way it smells. Brass glinted on the ridge, and Tomas watched 3 riders make their way over the horizon. The captain who led them was a neat man with a jaw like a trap. "You Tomas Maddox?" the captain asked when he came down the drive, voice polished with authority. "That depends on whose skin and why," Tomas said. Captain Halle unfolded a paper and squinted at the name. "There's been talk of a fugitive in these parts, half-blood, accused of murder. Reward posted. We have orders to bring in anyone fitting the description. Word and paper are 2 different kinds of violence." Tomas folded the paper and set it in his pocket. He lifted his chin and met the captain's eyes. "Ain't seen no one like that," he said. The captain's gaze slid to the cabin, to the curtain by the window, then back up the lane. "We'll be passing through. If you see anything, if I see anything, I'll say so." Tomas spoke the words easily, but kept no illusions. Lies and truths rubbed against each other in the dust, and there would be a reckoning sooner or later, when the riders left. Dust in their wake, Lizzie stood at the window and watched even though Tomas had told her to stay inside. He could feel the fear like a wind. She had been built to listen for threats and to shrink from them. She was learning instead to look for patterns that might give away a trap. One evening Luz took a stick outside and drew in the dirt. It was a small thing, but the shape that emerged, a bird with wings like tongues of flame, held her like a charm. "Firebird," she said when Tomas came near. "My mother painted that on our posts. She said it kept the bad from seeing us." Tomas crouched to look. "Looks like a good bird." She smiled then, a real small curl of something warm at the corners of her mouth. "We believed it could fly through the smoke and bring the living across." He put a hand onto the packed earth beside hers and felt the hum of a thing older than both of them. "Then it'll fly you out of here when you want it to." Later, when men in town began to whisper about a half-blood hiding in the hills, Luz would press her hand against that same little bird and promise herself that she would not let their whispers turn her into what they wanted to make of her. They came first as men who had worked rough jobs and now had the law's face painted on their chests. Joe Calloway led them, a man whose smile could be read like a wound. He claimed he was there for justice, for the way the world should be set right. "You sure you don't have someone stowed away?" he asked Tomas, leaning on his horse. "People say you take in strays." "I take in folks who need a hand," Tomas said. And then I set him on their feet. "Ain't nobody here to hand over." Joe's jaw flexed. There was a menace to him that smelled like old whiskey. "We'll have a look around," he said. "Won't take long." Tomas knew the language of threats, the casual assumption of ownership, the way men believed the world owed them obedience. He stepped between Joe and the cabin. "You go poking around my place, I'll finish the job myself," Tomas said, the words flat. Not a threat but a fact. The men did a slow, loud circling like vultures testing for weakness. They saw a woman through the curtain and cataloged her as a thing to be found. Tomas sat on the porch and whittled, letting the knife make a metronome of calm. Joe tried one last charm, then spat at the dry dirt and left with a promise that the issue wasn't settled. After they rode off, Luz came to him and watched him fold the wood with the same slow, ordinary gestures he'd used before the world decided to be cruel. She put her hand against his forearm. He felt the tremor that remained and the quiet gratitude that followed. "You lied for me," she said finally. He didn't lie about it. "I did. Why?" He looked out over the land as if the answer was something he could measure. "I cut you down because I don't like how men make stories out of people. Also, because I know the cost of a lie you have to carry to survive." She considered that and then nodded. The two of them began to move like two things bound by need, not lovers yet, not friends yet, but two people who had decided to keep each other safe when the world would rather not. Trust is a small thing first. It grows in inches. A bowl of stew, a blanket folded neat, a name spoken openly for the first time. One slow afternoon, Luz sat by the hearth and took off the thread that tied her hair, letting it fall in a long dark braid. "My name is not Luz," she said. "I took it because I thought it would be small enough to hide behind. My mother called me Marisol, sea and sun. Where we came from, names hold water and light." Thomas nodded as if he understood things about names the way he understood horses. "Marisol," he said, tasting the syllables. "It fits." She watched him, and the look on her face was careful and tentative, like a person balancing a truth in their palm. "I was half their color," she said, "and half another. They said that made me no one's child. They would not accept us. They would not listen." "You are someone's child," Thomas said. "You're mine now in the sense that I know your name." Marisol let out a small laugh, the sound a bristle of something like joy. The world outside their small house was loud and dangerous, but inside, after weeks of small kindnesses, she felt a room opening in her that could hold more than just the bare necessities. The cavalry returned with greater numbers, not just a captain and a pair of riders, but a company, the throbbing of horses and the starched clack of discipline. They came with proclamations and the assertion that law is a kind thing that always finds the wicked in the end. Thomas and Marisol watched them from a distance as if the men were a pack of wolves in uniform. A lieutenant dismounted and approached with the all-business gait of someone who believes the world is arranged to his liking. "You got a woman in here?" he asked Thomas. "Just the one I don't want hanged," Thomas answered. "And that is the truth." The lieutenant smirked at the refusal to surrender to commands. "We've got a warrant," he said. "We've got orders." "We got a family here," Thomas said. "If you have orders, show me the man who gave them. If he signed someone's life away on rumor and spite, then his handwriting is worth the same as dirt." Thomas's voice was steady. He had the look of a man who had measured the consequences and was willing to meet them. The lieutenant tethered his pride to the notion of rightness and moved on. He returned to his men and left Diego, one of his men, to watch the property from a distance. The boundaries of a private life and a public mandate were drawn in invisible lines, and Thomas stood on the one that mattered to him. They took the window at dawn, a gang of men with more blood in them than common sense. Joe Calloway had come back with friends who thought justice could be wrestled from the hands of men like Thomas. They tried to drag Marisol out in the early light. Rope on her wrists, voices that thought they were righteous. Thomas heard them before they made a sound that mattered. He grabbed his rifle and ran to the porch. The first shot was a blaze of panic and rage. A man fell. Another reached for a weapon and was met with Tomas's arm like wood across his jaw. The scuffle was close and ugly, the kind of thing that leaves men with new bruises and older memories. Marisol, who had been half-dragged, found her feet in the chaos. She had been given to hiding and to fear, but not to surrender. When Joe tried to swing at Thomas, she picked up a cast-iron skillet and connected it with the side of his head. The sound that came from Joe was not a curse, but a surprised oafishness that masked something else. He hadn't expected resistance from the woman he had called monster. The battle spilled into the yard. Thomas moved like a man who had practiced the economy of force, parrying rather than striking at random. He knocked rifles aside and used the men's momentum against them. Joe and his crew retreated because the law of that place had more to teach them about pain than about justice. They spat threats and left. When the dust settled, Marisol's hands trembled, not from exertion but from the fact she had used a weapon. Thomas took her hand and did not scold. He recognized the terrible clarity that comes from defending yourself. The world had given her no gentleness, so she had learned the language of survival. The next morning Thomas sat Marisol down and weighed the options like a man who knows a good plan is. The difference between staying whole and being broken. "They'll keep coming," he said. "People like Joe don't like it when you won't be put in the box they picked out for you. The cavalry will tighten their net." Marisol's face was calm. "I can't stay," she said. "Not here." "Then we go south," Thomas answered. "There's a country where the law don't follow like a dog on a leash. We can cross the river, find timber, set up a place where your name is yours and no one else's." "To leave?" she asked. "To be a ghost so they have no satisfaction?" "To choose your life rather than be chosen by them," Thomas said. The decision was a hand they both took. They packed light, saddled horses, wrapped the bundle, and left just before the moon gave up the last of its light. Thomas did not want the camera of men's memory to mark their track. So he tucked the horses to side trails and let the hoofprints scatter in the night dust as they crossed the border. Marisol looked back at the small house where she had learned to eat and sleep and be soft in the company of another person. "I'll remember this place," she said. "I'll remember the way you lick your lamp. I'll remember you learning to smile without being scared," Thomas replied. They rode into a night that was not clean but was theirs. They made a mistake 2 days out. Thomas trusted the road and the kindness of a man who offered information about a safer route. The man had a crooked smile and a gambler's instincts. At a narrow wash, shots cracked like broken glass. The sound of lead meeting flesh was a cruel punctuation. Thomas felt the heat of a bullet bloom across his side. He went down hard, his breath a frightened animal. Marisol fought like a woman who had learned every lesson twice, once by living it herself, once by watching others. She dragged Thomas into a trench of scrub and stone, pressed her hands to the wound, and cursed the sky. The men came close enough to see the glint of his boots and thought to finish him, but Marisol was there, furious, precise, uncowed. She fired at the nearest horse, the officer's face registering that he hadn't accounted for resistance in the woman he had underestimated. The men wavered, then fled, not out of honor but of a jaundiced fear. Bad luck and better aim bought them a chance. Thomas lost a lot of blood. He bled where men who survive do, slow and precise. Marisol made a tourniquet from her scarf and stuffed rag into the wound. Then she held him through a night that felt like an ocean that wanted to swallow them. When the danger passed, Thomas opened his eyes and found Marisol's face bent close. Her hands were stained brown. "You gonna live?" she asked. He cupped her wrist and felt the life there, warm and stubborn. "If you keep fussing over me, I have to," he rasped. She smiled, the corners of her mouth a new kind of tenderness. "Good," she said. "We have a ranch to find." By autumn they found a hollow carved by a river that moved with the stubbornness of a thing that will not be tamed. Pines held the sky up, and the ground gave a soft answer to steps. Thomas hobbled at first, then learned a new gait in his stride. They built a house of the wood the land gave them and a corral for a couple of horses. The place was not much. It was the kind of small enough that their hands could change it. Marisol stitched in the evenings, humming a song she remembered as a child. The house smelled like pines and stew. In the mornings, Thomas taught her to break a colt, to talk to the beasts in a tone that promised fairness. She learned quickly, the way someone with little to lose learns, with quick attention and a hunger for things that do not shame. Months passed. The wound on Thomas's side closed into a pale crescent. The nights were long and full of good talk. They traded stories, not always pleasant, and found that their histories fit together like two halves of an old map. One dawn, when the frost still clung to the rope, Marisol told Thomas something private with a smile that made him catch his breath. "I'm with child," she said. As if the words were fragile and precious, Thomas's laugh came out like a bark of joy and shock. "That's on me," he said, stunned and delighted. "We'll name the baby for the river. News travels slow, and sometimes it goes quiet. But men like Joe do not forget where they left a wrong undone." A winter out of the trees, Tomas woke to the sight of a rider on the ridge who did not belong to them. The horse's coat was dull, the rider's hat pulled, and his eyes had the old claim to ownership. They rode in numbers this time, men with grudges given a shape. Tomas looked at Marisol, at the swell of her belly, and his hands knew the weight of what they defended. The attack that came was not about justice. It was about revenge, about men who needed a target for the ugliness that lived inside them. They threatened to burn what they could and to take what they wanted. Tomas and his neighbors, a small, ragged community of folks who had come to make a life in the pines, met them with a line of grit and rifles. The fight was close and desperate. Marisol stayed away from the center at first, holding to the baby's small life as if it were a talisman. But when a man tried to cut the corral gate, she lifted a gun and let reason be the louder voice. In the end, the invaders fled into the cold, their pride broken but their capacity for harm intact. Tomas tended to the wounded. Marisol pressed her hand to her belly and felt the baby kick like an answer. When the last man rode off, Tomas found himself holding Marisol in a way that was both shelter and claim. He pressed his forehead to hers and did not say anything. Words were small. The future was big and raw and theirs. The spring warmed the river, and with it came the sounds of new life. Marisol labored in the small house with Tomas by her side, his hands steady as he guided. Soot and sweat and prayer mixing into a single texture under his fingernails. When the child came, a girl with Tomas's eyes and Marisol's dark hair, the sky let go of a storm as if the weather itself wanted to mark it. She was small and fierce and immediately demanded quiet and milk. Marisol cradled her like the world had finally returned what it had taken. They named the child Sila for the sky they had crossed, and for the way her first cry reached up like a bird. Tomas watched them both as if he had discovered treasure. When Marisol looked at him, grief and joy braided into a line across her face. "You gave me back my name," she said. "You gave me a reason," Tomas replied. It was true in ways he hadn't known he needed. The house held them. The baby slept with the soft certainty that she belonged, and the land outside hummed with a promise that people could be differently made and still survive. Word came again. Persistence is a kind of evil men practice with dedication, but this time it found a different community, neighbors who could shoot straight and cared for each other. When the men returned to settle their old score, they met not one rancher but a line of people who would not be driven. Thomas and Marisol stood together on the porch with Sila asleep inside. The men who came wore the same old stares, but the people who met them had new fire. A neighbor with a crutch and a steady eye, another with a laugh that could unravel hatred. A child who had been taught to hide who now held the lantern for courage. They formed a barrier of not being alone. It mattered that the people in the pines had one another. It mattered that the world had given them small victories, a fence fixed, a harvest saved, a child born in a house where she would be taught to read the stars instead of fearing them. The invaders were driven off again. This time they did not return. Perhaps the rumor of resistance had reached some other ears. Perhaps they simply tired of chasing shadows. When the last horse faded down the trail, they came back inside and closed the door. Tomas took Marisol's hand. "We survived them," he said. She smiled, and the little dimple at her cheek made his heart unsteady. "We did," she said, "and we will keep on surviving." Years later, under the same wide sky, Tomas taught Sila to ride along the river, and she learned the shape of the land like a promise. Marisol painted a firebird on the post of their gate, bright red and gold and impossible to miss. They made a place that belonged not to a rumor or a man's cruelty, but to the people who lived in it. A neighbor came by sometimes, an old soldier who would tip his hat and call Thomas stubborn. A child would chase the dog and tumble in the grass until laughing hurt. And Marisol would watch him and remember the rope, and the tree and the hand that cut it dot when travelers asked the story along the way. They told it with truth and with the kind of poetry that grows from facts. Made human, they tried to hang her for being what she was. A man took her down. They were married some winters later and had a child, and they built a life where a life could grow. It was not the whole story. Stories rarely are. The rest, the nights of fear, the small victories, the endless, patient work of patching people, lived in the seams, in the bandage on Tomas's side, in the scar that Marisol no longer hid, in the way Sila would put a little hand on a stranger's knee like an offering of trust at night. When the wind leaned into the eaves, Tomas would say softly to Marisol, "You don't get to be the one that finishes my story." She would run her fingers along his jaw and answer, "Then let's make sure it's a good one." They had not been saved by a law or by any righteous man in uniform. They had been saved in the end by the small, stubborn choices of two people who refused to let the world finish them on somebody else's terms. And the firebird that Marisol painted, the one with wings of flame, hung bright and crooked over their gate, a declaration that some things, once set alight, refused to be put out.